Deck building is one of the most important fundamentals of learning any card game, and in today's video I'll be discussing the top 5 things I think a deck builder should know. Now I want to make it very clear before I get into any topic with this video, deck building is subjective. It's based on one's own personal experiences, thoughts, and feelings. So this video is based on my personal thoughts and feelings about deck buildings. I understand there are some people who agree with me and some people who don't, and there's going to be people who feel like I left some very key things out. But I want to make it very clear, it's just things that I think are really important for deck building when approaching any new deck in any card game, or just if you're a veteran player to look at deck building from a different perspective. And when you're done with this video, if you guys enjoy seeing content like this, please make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. Do not forget to hit the notification bell so you guys always get my newest videos coming out. Now, the first major thing I want to discuss when it comes to deck building, in my personal opinion, is finding out your style of play. Now, whether you're a veteran or a new player of any card game, or if you've been playing different card games, it's really important, and you'll discover it very quickly, your style of play. If you played card games for a while, or if you're new to them, you've probably seen this chart or heard these terms said by other players before. And while this is an overgeneralization of deck building, it's very simple on how a lot of decks are built and how they move. Aggro decks are very fast decks. They do a lot in the early game to do an explosive play in the first turn of their grade 3 turn, or another card game like their exploding turn, and then the deck begins to lose steam. Control decks are decks that have some form of play style that will control the player's board and manipulate what they have going on to slow the game down or speed the game up to our benefit. And then finally, combo decks. Combo decks are decks that rely on certain pieces to perform a certain set of skills or effects and abilities that might stack or might repeat to help this deck perform the best at utilizing this combo at its full potential to win the game. Mid-range decks are decks that obviously can do all of this, or they do something solid that benefits one to the 3 sides of the whole pyramid that's going on. And then tempo and value just describes what sort of benefit you get from playing these decks. Control decks, you gain more value from them because they'll slow the game down to benefit you. You can incorporate more card advantage, more power, whatever it might be to benefit you later. Whereas tempo decks, you have to pay very close attention to how many resources you drop on that board and how many cards you attack with and guard with or use for cost, whatever it might be, to continuously rush your opponent or beat down your opponent in the same manner every single time. It's really important to understand where you fall in this category as an individual, because deck building for you will become a lot more meaningful and a lot better when you understand what type of deck you're building and what you want that deck to do. For example, I like control decks, so naturally somebody will point me to decks like Gandiva, Eugene, Prison for control, because these decks have some aspect that affect my opponent and will benefit me as the player. But if I pick up a deck like Shoujo Doji, where it does have some form of control element to it, but it's a very fast and aggressive deck, and I have to pay attention to what resources are dropped in the early game, and it's very explosive in the early game, and if I make the wrong play, it might mess me up and it might throw the whole game off, that deck might not be for me. All of those decks that I've discussed have some form of control, but their applications to doing it are all different and don't fit my playstyle. So because I know a deck like Shoujo Doji is very fast and aggressive and is more towards the aggro deck, I probably won't approach it, and I probably won't be able to play it as well as I could if I picked up something like Gandiva. Gandiva is a slow burn deck. This deck, or snowball deck as some people would call it, this deck will get stronger as the game goes on, and I continue to control my opponent and slow the game down to my benefit to acquire more bound units to increase the power of my front row. Prison has the prison aspect. This forces your opponents to commit resources and give up advantage that they might have from me giving them damage or building up soul, so that this way they can get their units back while I hold on to them and gain effects from doing so. Because I understand my playstyle as a player and I understand what those two decks do that fit me, I have now different varieties of control decks I can choose from, and it just comes down to which one I like, maybe aesthetically more or playstyle wise more. Me personally, I've been playing Kagero since the game first came out, so I'll probably go with Gandiva over Seraph, but to somebody else, Seraph might be the better option than Gandiva, because Seraph is very automatic, it's very direct, it's a control deck, knows exactly what it wants to do, whereas Gandiva, it's the same way, but it's a slow burn deck. You do have to pay attention to what you bind, you got to pay attention to your own resources, you have to pay attention to what pieces you have prior to going into Gandiva, and there's just a lot more thoughts to be made into that deck than there is something like Seraph. In addition to my point, I do want you guys not to get stuck on this. Do not get stuck just to picking up decks or deck building for decks that fit your playstyle. It's very important that as your skills in the game grow, or as you've been playing the game long enough, you experiment with different playstyles, because like people, your playstyles will change, especially during the meta. For example, if you're in a meta right now where being aggro and being very fast gets counteracted by a control deck that can clear the board like every single turn, just shut the aggro player down, then you're going to have to adapt to that strategy of what's popular to obviously compete at a higher level. And when it comes to fixing issues, this leads me to my other point, which is resource management. Now, resource management is tricky because not every deck needs resource management and not every deck wants resource management. I know that might be surprising, but I have a couple of examples to help get this point through. Resource management refers to naturally a unit or a card that has an effect that will help you get back a resource that's vital to your play. For example, Shoujo Doji has the grade 1 stealth unit that when bound will countercharge itself, it'll move itself into the bind zone, you can call it back later. This is a fantastic resource management piece for a deck that strictly uses counterblast for its card effects and can use its own ability to remove itself from the game to give you a resource that you can take advantage of later. Resource management is just up to the player, and while I think every deck should incorporate it if it can, it is important to note that not every deck will need it or want it. Your resource management is something that you not just develop in deck building when playing decks, but also something you will develop as a player as you continue to play more Vanguard. It's very important to know how much counterblast you have, how much counterblast you'll need in the following turn to do all of your plays, how much soul blast you need for certain card effects. Energy is a new resource, and outside of just energy blasting 7-4 drawing 1, we're getting a lot of new cards now, generically speaking, for each nation that relies on energy to perform a certain effect. A lot of new waves of Vanguards now are actually incorporating energy into them. Lukier uses energy, and the new Glass deck uses energy as well. Those are all vital resources that you have to pay attention to, and while deck building, I think it's important to incorporate a resource management in there, especially for road decks as well, because road decks usually have problems with their resources already, and that's why they're sort of slow or they fall behind to have resource available to you. And if your nation just doesn't have a really good generic resource management piece, then you have to make cuts or find pieces that can do what a card can do as strong without eating away at that resource to your core strategy, or you might just have to relook at your deck and see if you need to make a change to your play style or how do you approach this deck for making up for that resource management issue. Your play style and resource management, all important aspects of becoming a good Vanguard player, but obviously with Vanguard, we need to look at the main thing, which is the Vanguard. In Vanguard, it is extremely important that you have a full understanding of what your Vanguard can do, the resources around it, the pieces that support it, and what exactly is that deck's play style. Solrairon is a deck that I love to death. I love that deck to pieces. I have played that deck so many times on my channel. I have so many different builds. Same thing with Hassret. I know those decks in and out. I know what their pieces can do. I know what resource management it needs. I know exactly what to expect every time I play Solrairon in certain matchups because I've just practiced and played with that deck so much. Mastering your Vanguard and then mastering the pieces that support it is so huge. Knowing how much you need of something and ratios is important too. And ratios are a tricky thing in Vanguard because while there's a whole calculator and math that can be done for it, I'm telling you now, I'm not doing all that math for it. But while those exist, it's important to understand how much you need of something that incorporates your Vanguard strategy and gets it to work. And this approach, I think, should be taken for all decks. Now, assuming you're following all of my tips for deck building, you know what your Vanguard wants to do, you have a winning image, or you understand your deck's playstyle, you understand your playstyle, you've got resource management. I think this is the time where when you're building a deck, you experiment a lot. Vanguard in standard format specifically has over 3 years worth of card support. And while each nation, I think at this point has maybe 200-300 something cards, I found that only 50 to 70 of those cards are actually worth playing in most decks. They either power crept each other out or they just don't do something for that strategy. But I do think it's important that people do actually, especially right now in standard, experiment with text as much as possible. Now, the word tech in card games refers to a card that people play for a certain situation, or they play at low copies to make up for a weakness in this deck or a certain opportunity that when it comes up, the tech unit will be at its full advantage. A good example of this is in the prior list for decks like Luard and Solrairon that needed more time to set up or slower, they incorporate a grade 1 unit that had the ability to retire herself and perfect guard a 5th or 6th attack. That's actually really huge because at that point, any attacks that to me is above 3 or more usually have an effect to restand or gain power or critical or triggers have been revealed, and completely denying that off of the rear guard without eating away at your hand is huge. It's huge because it means that you don't have to worry about committing resources from your hand that you want to use for next turn to stop that. So that grade 1 tech piece was fantastic, especially in Luard, because Luard recycled out its grade 1 normal units. I just pre-recall that unit, and you could leave it chilling in the back until you needed it. So Rhyron took advantage of that card because, again, the deck is a little bit slower. It falls into the mid-range combo area. So until you get Soul Rhyron, you hit those pieces, and depending on certain matchups, you need something to slow the game down depending on what you're playing against. And at that period of Vanguard, it was all about speed. It was fast, 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 fast. But examples of techs that I can personally relate to are techs in my Alden video. I made a video on how I broke Alden, and one of the core techs of that was the order ride line for that deck. Playing the order line such as Teethful, Cadogan, the order that came with those cards was huge, because one of the core aspects of Alden that was bad was the fact that the deck didn't have a strong early game from my experience. It didn't make good numbers even with the light lead and Ermac support, as well as the fact that you didn't make a good board without eating away at your hand. And because this is an aggro deck that does not pop off at full power until you hit Alden, you wanted to go first. You wanted to, rush in the early game, finally hit Alden, get your 4-5 attacks off, and then try to win the game as soon as possible. Experimenting with these wacky cards is the only way you'll be able to take lower tier decks to the next level. You have to experiment, and I feel like something that's been missing a lot from Standard, and this has been discussed by other players before, is that I feel a lot of people have fallen into the hive mind of deck building. It seems like once people figure out like what the top 5 or 6 decks are, that's the only thing everybody's playing. They're playing the exact 5 to 6 same decks, or when a deck comes into the format from a new set, they'll play the new stuff for like about a month or maybe like 2 weeks until it fades into obscurity again, and people stop experimenting with the lower tier stuff. They only experiment with the high tier stuff because naturally you expect to see the same 5 or 6 decks at a tournament, and you obviously want to find these cards that can tech out the match to shut the deck down or do something beneficial to you as the player. I don't think that as a deck builder you should ever stop experimenting or trying out different techs. Even if the card seems bad, go ahead and give it a try, because it might be worth it in those scenarios, or it might just do something for the deck that surprises you. Another example of this that I can relate to is in my Maelstrom deck from earlier this year. I incorporated a card that fixed one of the deck's core issues, which was something to do in the early game as well as maintaining power during the battle phase for all of your attacks. To mitigate this issue before the introduction of the new card, Male Coliseum Dragon, I played a card called Tsunami Brave Shooter. Now this card is so simple that it's so strong in the deck though. Tsunami Brave Shooter's effect gives it 5k power continuously if there's a grade 2 or higher unit within the same column as this card. At that time, we had also gotten a grade 2 promo support from Maelstrom that lets you swap rear guards in a different column or the same column as this unit to gain additional attack. Because I knew I was going to have a grade 2 guaranteed in any column I was playing in, I put in Tsunami and I was guaranteed my 5k power every single time. This was huge because on Persona Ride turns, you could make this card into a magic number. In the early game, you could drop it and not feel bad about it because you're going to get its power later. It was good at every period with Maelstrom without having to worry about first or fourth attack to gain full value of this card. It just was valuable throughout the entirety of the time it was in its deck until it obviously got outclassed by the new dragon to make it work. But I would have never played with that card or experimented with it if it wasn't for Deer Days. Deer Days is kind of like where I go to lab out and make like the wackiest decks possible, because while it is a couple of sets behind, it at least has enough up-to-date stuff in it to where I can still try these cards that people probably weren't thinking about when the cards were actually out for the deck. Nobody was thinking about Tsunami Brave Shooter until I put it in. Nobody was playing the order line in their Alden deck until I put it in. I don't care what nobody says. I'm going to go ahead on a rant here and take advantage for that. I see so many lists on Deck Xanders. Those decks are so obscure and so roguely played that I just don't imagine anybody actually sitting there and like saying, this might be good. It's just very apparent to me that we need to get out of this mentality of experimenting, of not experimenting with our decks. A deck building is the opportunity to experiment. You play test it out. I think that it's about maybe 1 or 2 games with a card. You can try it and see if it works. And at that point, you don't have to, keep that card in your deck. You can go back into maximizing the cards that give you the full value in your deck, or trying out a different tech or other piece that might become a staple in the deck, or a fun tech to have for this matchup that the deck is really bad in. Never stop experimenting with your deck building. Deck building will be one of the most important things you will have to think about and continuously learn and change as you continue to play the game of Cardfight Vanguard. But it's important to understand these sort of tropes or topics that I discussed today. I think it's important that you understand how your deck wants to win, what your Vanguard does, where you as the player fall in terms of the combo, control, aggro style of play. So that this way, when you actually are deck building, you have more fun and you're investing your both money as well as your time into a nation that fits into how you want to have fun with Vanguard. Obviously, there are a lot of other deck building tropes or topics I can discuss, and I might do that in a separate video. As for right now, let me know what you guys think about this video in the comment section below and tell me your deck building tropes or ideas that you've learned throughout your years of playing Vanguard or just card games in general, and share with everybody in the chat. With that being said, card fighters, I am done for the day. I hope you guys have a great weekend at the time making this video, and I'll catch you later. Peace.